Colossus is usually drawn as an answer to a very direct question. How do you show strength? You make the body enormous. You make it metallic. You plant the feet, widen the shoulders, and create the feeling that nothing in the image could move him. For this piece, I wanted to begin from the opposite direction. I wanted the strongest material in the image to feel as if it had just released an impossible amount of movement. I wanted the figure to be solid, but the composition around him to bend, flow, and almost lose its balance. The commission was an A3 full-figure Colossus with an Art Nouveau influence. That sounds like a clear instruction, but it immediately creates a contradiction. Colossus is weight, mass, armor, and impact. Art Nouveau is usually associated with flowing lines, asymmetry, organic forms, and decoration that seems to grow across a surface. One language wants to stand still, the other refuses to stop moving. That contradiction became the reason to make the image. Colossus is Pyotr Rasputin, a mutant who can transform his body into an organic steel-like form. The transformation gives him extraordinary strength and durability, but the thing that has always made the character interesting is that his personality is not simply an extension of his power. He is often a gentle, protective figure. He is an artist as well as a fighter. The steel does not erase sensitivity. It gives physical form to his desire to protect other people. If I only draw the metal and the muscles, I can show what he can do, but I may miss who he is. The design needs both qualities. It needs the monumental body, but it also needs thought, rhythm, and a kind of restraint. The force should feel enormous because it is controlled. The Art Nouveau part of the commission could not just be a decorative border placed around a normal superhero drawing. That would make the influence superficial. What interests me about Art Nouveau is the idea that structure and decoration can become the same thing. A line can describe a body, create a pattern, guide the eye, and organize the entire page at once. The curves do not sit on top of the image. They are the image. My most specific influence for that language was Robert Stewart Sheriffs. Sheriffs was a Scottish illustrator and caricaturist who studied fine art and heraldic design. His work was influenced by artists, including Aubrey Beardsley and Alphonse Mucha, but he developed a very personal graphic language. He worked in magazines, theater, and film caricature, and book illustration. He often treated the human figure less like a neutral piece of anatomy and more like a designed pattern. Sheriffs described figures and faces as patterns to be studied and remembered. That idea is very close to what I wanted here. A face can still be recognizable while becoming an arrangement of curves, dark shapes, and repeated marks. A body can still feel powerful while its anatomy is reorganized into a visual rhythm. That is especially useful with Colossus because his metal body is already divided into sections. The bands across his arms, the reflective shapes on his torso, the planes of his face, and the repeated shadows between the muscles can all become ornament. Instead of drawing a normal body and then adding chrome, I can build the body out of the language of reflection. The metal is not one gray surface. It is a sequence of decisions about black and white, continuity, and interruption. One dark shape turns a shoulder, a thin white gap separates two plates, a repeated curve makes the arm feel cylindrical. From a distance, those marks become mass. Up close, they remain a pattern. The second major reference was George Bellows' painting Dempsey and Firpo from 1924. Bellows painted a famous moment from the 1923 heavyweight fight between Jack Dempsey and Luis Angel Firpo. Firpo knocked Dempsey out of the ring, even though Dempsey eventually returned and won the fight. Bellows chose the brief moment when the champion is falling through the ropes and into the crowd. That choice matters. The painting does not summarize the fight or show its final result. It freezes the instant when the expected order has broken. One body is still standing, the other has become a diagonal force moving out of the ring. The viewpoint is low, close to the spectators, so the falling boxer seems to enter the viewer's space. I did not want to reproduce the boxers or copy the painting, literally. I wanted to borrow what the composition does. There is a rooted figure above, a body falling violently toward the foreground, and a low viewpoint that makes the viewer part of the impact. Bellows gave me the basic action. Sheriffs gave me the language for redesigning that action. In my digital sketch, I begin by finding Colossus's head and upper torso. The first marks are loose and uncertain. I am not drawing details yet. I am trying to establish the direction of the shoulders, the angle of the spine, and the relationship between his face and the arm coming toward us. The foreshortened fist becomes one of the most important decisions. It has to be much larger than it would appear in a neutral pose. If it is too small, the image loses its impact. If it becomes too large, it can hide the figure and make the anatomy unreadable. I keep adjusting it until the fist feels like the first thing to cross the boundary between the picture and the viewer. I use different construction colors for the two large bodies. That lets me separate the standing figure from the falling mass while they are still overlapping. The red construction lines build Colossus upward. The blue figure moves down and out of the frame. Even before the drawing is finished, those two color directions create the main rhythm. One body holds its position, while the other becomes almost pure momentum. The composition is crowded, but it is not meant to feel random. Colossus's head sits high in the image, his shoulders spread outward and his arm drives forward. The falling figure occupies a huge part of the foreground and creates a diagonal that cuts across the page. On the right, the impact shape acts like punctuation. It gives the force a direction and prevents the open area from becoming dead space. Behind the figures, I begin with a loose field of construction lines. Later, those lines become long waves that move around the body. They are partly atmosphere, partly landscape, and partly a record of the impact. I do not want the background to describe a realistic boxing ring. It should feel like the world itself has been pushed sideways. The digital sketch is fast in the recording, but the speed can be misleading. A time-lapse makes every decision look inevitable. In reality, the sketch is a negotiation. I move between anatomy and abstraction. I want the body to be readable, but I also want every shape to participate in the larger design. Too much realism would make the image stiff. Too much distortion would make the action unclear. Once the digital structure is resolved, I transfer it to the A3 sheet on a lightbox. The colored guide remains visible underneath the paper while I begin the physical line work. This is where the relationship to the drawing changes. Digitally, I can move, transform, and erase entire areas. On paper, every ink mark becomes part of the history of the image. I start by establishing the contours that will hold everything else together: the head, shoulders, the large arm, and the major edges of the falling body. These are not necessarily the most exciting marks to watch, but they are structural. If the contour is wrong, every pattern inside it will reinforce the wrong form. The face is especially important because it carries both character and style. Colossus needs to remain recognizable, but I do not want a photographic face placed inside an ornamental body. The features become larger graphic shapes. The brow, cheek, nose, lips, and metal reflections lock together like pieces of a mask. This is where the sheriff's influence becomes most visible to me. The face is treated as a pattern without losing its expression. Then I begin building the metal. The repeated bands around the arms and torso create volume, but they also create tempo. A line turns around the cylinder of an arm, disappears into shadow, and returns on the other side. Black areas interrupt the sequence, white areas create reflected light. The same system repeats at different scales across the body, so the figure feels unified, even when the anatomy becomes exaggerated. At a certain point, the drawing changes through the addition of large black shapes. This is always a dangerous and satisfying stage. A contour can still feel temporary. A black field is a commitment. When the dark mass enters the falling figure and the lower areas of the composition, the balance of the entire page changes. The black does several things at once. It pushes Colossus' lighter metal body forward. It gives the falling figure weight. It creates a hard graphic contrast that connects the piece to book illustration and comics. It also makes the white paper active. What was previously empty background becomes light pressing against the dark form. After the black areas are established, I can draw back into them with white. Those marks are not exactly corrections. They are a second direction of drawing. At first, I create darkness on white paper, then I carve light back into the darkness. Thin white seams, reflections, and small details allow the black mass to regain volume without losing its graphic power. This process is one reason I still enjoy working physically. The material resists. The pen changes pressure. The black is not perfectly uniform. The white marker behaves differently over ink than a digital brush behaves over a layer. Those limitations produce a surface that remembers how it was made. The long background lines arrive later. They flow behind Colossus, gather around the impact symbol, and continue into the patterned ground at the bottom of the page. Drawing them is repetitive, but repetition is not the same as emptiness. Each line has to respond to the one before it. Together, they create a current. This is where the Art Nouveau influence stops being an accessory and becomes the environment. The curved lines do not merely decorate Colossus, they make his force visible. Because they bend around the figure, they suggest that the space has been displaced by him. The strongest body in the composition is surrounded by a world that has become fluid. The impact shape on the right is intentionally artificial. It is not a realistic explosion. It is a graphic sign, almost a piece of lettering without a word. Comics often use marks like this to turn invisible actions into visible objects. A sound, a blow, a vibration, or a sudden change in speed can become a shape. Here it balances the large figures and gives the open red field a sharp point of tension. When the black and white drawing is complete, the piece has the feeling of an engraving or an illustrated book. The line work carries everything: metal, atmosphere, anatomy, distance, and movement. The dense foreground patterns and the flowing background lines create two different kinds of time. The body falls in a fraction of a second, while the surface records hours of patient work. I return to the piece later to create the colored version. There is no recorded coloring session in this process, so the finished color image becomes a separate final state rather than a false continuation of the time-lapse. I did not want naturalistic color. The palette is very limited and very loud: turquoise steel, hot fuchsia, acid yellow, deep green, and white highlights. The fuchsia is not a passive background. It occupies the page with almost the same force as the figures. The yellow turns the landscape and line work into light. The deep green replaces much of the black and keeps the composition anchored. Turquoise changes the meaning of the metal. It is still cool and reflective, but it no longer tries to imitate real steel. It becomes a color identity. The repeated highlights across Colossus's body, read like reflections, but also like pieces of a larger decorative system. The color does not cover the ink drawing. It reveals another organization already hidden inside it. The limited palette also connects the final image to screen printing, posters, and the history of reproduced comics. Large fields of flat color allow the complex line work to remain visible. The image can be ornate, without becoming muddy. From a distance, you see a few strong color masses. Up close, the patterns break open into hundreds of individual decisions. What interests me about using historical references is not the possibility of making a superhero look old. I am not trying to disguise a comic image as a museum painting. I am interested in what one visual language can teach another. Bellows teaches me how to choose a moment. The fight lasted less than 4 minutes, and its final winner was not the person who appears dominant in the painting, but the selected instant became larger than the outcome. Sheriffs teaches me to see the body as design. A face can be character and pattern at the same time. Art Nouveau teaches me that structure and ornament do not have to be enemies. Colossus brings those lessons together because he is already built from contradictions. He is a gentleman with a body made for impact. He is an artist who can become a weapon. His surface looks rigid, but his transformation is fluid. He appears indestructible, yet the stories around him constantly test what strength is supposed to protect. As an architect, I also think about how force moves through a structure. A column is not powerful because it looks heavy. It is powerful because it receives a load and transfers it somewhere else. In this image, the composition behaves in a similar way. The fist creates a direction. The shoulders distribute it. The falling body carries it toward the viewer. The background lines absorb it and spread it across the page. That is why the final pose could not simply be a portrait of Colossus standing still. Strength becomes more interesting when it changes the condition of everything around it. A powerful figure needs resistance, consequence, and a direction of movement. Otherwise, the muscles are only description. The drawing process follows the same path. The sketch begins as possibility. The ink creates structure. The black shapes add consequence. The white marks recover light. The background lines distribute movement. The color reorganizes the finished drawing one final time. By the end, the image no longer belongs completely to any one reference. It is not Bellows, Sheriffs, or a conventional X-Men illustration. It has taken something from each of them and forced those influences to negotiate with one another on the page. That negotiation is what I wanted the finished piece to preserve. Colossus remains monumental, but he is not frozen. The steel body is made from fluid lines. The violent moment is held together by ornament. The empty space becomes active. Even the final color feels as if it might continue moving after the frame ends. For me, the strongest part of the image is not simply the fist, the muscle, or the metal. It is the relationship between force and flow. Colossus becomes powerful because every line around him records that something has moved. The goal was never to decorate Colossus with Art Nouveau. It was to translate him into a language where steel becomes line, impact becomes pattern, and strength is visible because the entire image bends around it.